People often assume that leaving quietly means a lack of courage, but sometimes it reflects something far more deliberate. As we grow older, we begin to recognize that not every ending needs an explanation. There is a quiet shift that happens when clarity replaces the need to be understood. And in that space, silence can feel more honest than words. If this reflection resonates with you, take a moment to pause and consider how your own understanding of closure has changed over time. By the time someone reaches their 50s, they have lived through enough cycles of connection and disappointment to see patterns more clearly. They have watched apologies that never led to change, conversations that circled without resolution, and relationships that slowly eroded despite effort. Over time, something subtle but powerful begins to form: a reduced tolerance for emotional noise and a deeper respect for personal energy. One of the first quiet behaviors you may notice is the absence of explanation where there once would have been long conversations. In earlier years, people often feel compelled to justify their decisions. They explain, defend, and sometimes over-explain, hoping to be understood or validated. But after decades of experience, many come to realize that explanations rarely change outcomes. People hear what they are ready to hear, not necessarily what is being said. So instead of explaining, they step back, not out of indifference, but out of recognition. Another subtle pattern is how quickly they recognize emotional imbalance. When someone consistently gives more than they receive, it may take years to fully accept that the imbalance is not temporary, it is structural. A smart person over 50 no longer assumes things will even out. They have seen enough to know that patterns tend to repeat, not resolve. And so they withdraw quietly. No confrontation, no announcement, just a gradual removal of presence. You might also notice a shift in how they respond to disrespect. In younger years, disrespect often triggers reaction, defensiveness, arguments, attempts to correct the behavior. But with time, there is a deeper understanding. People who consistently disrespect others are not unaware. They are simply unconcerned. Once that realization settles in, the response changes. Instead of trying to fix the dynamic, they remove themselves from it entirely, not because they cannot respond, but because they no longer feel the need to. There is also a quiet awareness of emotional fatigue. After years of navigating complex relationships, many people develop a sensitivity to what drains them. It is not always obvious. Sometimes it is a tone, a pattern of inconsistency, or a subtle lack of consideration. These small things accumulate, and eventually something shifts internally. The question is no longer, how do I make this work? But rather, why am I still participating in something that feels this way? At that point, leaving becomes less dramatic and more natural. Some people interpret this as coldness, but in reality, it is often a form of self-respect that has taken years to build. It is the result of learning, sometimes painfully, that not all connections are meant to be maintained simply because they exist. About halfway through this reflection, it may be worth asking yourself something quietly personal. Have you ever reached a point where explaining yourself felt more exhausting than simply walking away? There is a particular kind of clarity that comes with age. It is not loud or forceful. It does not demand attention. It simply observes and decides. And once that decision is made, it rarely seeks validation. Another behavior that often goes unnoticed is the disappearance of emotional negotiation. Younger individuals may try to renegotiate relationships, setting boundaries, expressing needs repeatedly, hoping the other person will adjust. But after many attempts over many years, there comes a realization. Some people do not respond to boundaries. They test them. And when that becomes clear, the approach changes. Instead of reinforcing boundaries again and again, they choose distance. Because distance, unlike words, does not require cooperation from the other person. There is also a shift in how they view closure itself. Closure is often romanticized as a conversation, a final understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of what went wrong. But life rarely unfolds that neatly. More often, closure is internal. It is a quiet acceptance that something has run its course. For someone over 50, closure does not always come from the other person. It comes from seeing clearly, without illusion. And once that clarity is reached, there is no longer a need to revisit the situation, reanalyze it, or extract one final explanation. Another subtle sign is how they handle disappointment. In earlier years, disappointment often carries a sense of urgency, the need to address it, fix it, talk it through. But over time, disappointment becomes quieter. It is felt, acknowledged, and then placed in context. Not every disappointment deserves a response. Some simply inform a decision, and that decision may be to leave. There is also an increasing awareness of time, not in a dramatic or fearful way, but in a practical sense. Time is no longer seen as something abundant and undefined. It becomes more tangible, more valuable, and with that awareness comes a sharper filter for where energy is invested. When someone reaches this stage, they begin to ask different questions. Not, can this be saved? But, is this worth the time it would take to save it? If the answer is no, they do not linger. They exit, quietly, without announcement. without closure in the traditional sense. At first glance, this behavior can seem abrupt or even harsh, but if you look closely, it is often the opposite. It is a form of restraint. Instead of engaging in conflict, prolonging tension, or forcing explanations that may not be received, they choose stillness. There is a kind of dignity in that choice. It reflects an understanding that not every relationship needs to end in dialogue. Some end in realization, and that realization is enough. As we approach the end of this reflection, take a moment to consider how your own boundaries have evolved, even if only in subtle ways. Focus theory. Thanks you for listening and being part of this reflection. In the end, walking away without warning is not always about the other person. It is often about an internal threshold that has been reached quietly over time, a threshold shaped by experience, reflection, and a growing commitment to peace over explanation. Some people will never understand that kind of departure. They may interpret it through their own expectations, their own habits of communication. But understanding is no longer the goal. Clarity is. And for those who have reached that clarity, leaving without closure is not an absence of respect. It is, in many ways, the final expression of it.